Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 61 of SCOTONOMICS. Hello to all of our long-time viewers on YouTube, Facebook, and also on Twitter. And just as importantly, hello to Karen Van Sweden, who's joining us live this evening. Hello, Karen. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yes, all the better for meeting you in person, which we did last on Friday.
Yes. Episode 61 we got to without meeting each other. And we were both a bit worried that we wouldn't do a 62 once we'd actually met in person, but we managed to get through that, didn't we?
Yeah, and you've organised so much for our live event, which is coming up at the end of March. It's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, so that was the main reason, apart from to catch up with some friends, was to look at SCOTONOMICS live, because I actually haven't been back to Scotland since August 2019. So there was a lot to do that I've been meaning to do for a while, but the main focus was on SCOTONOMICS Live, which was fantastic because we've sorted out our venues. So we've now got 3 venues. We've now got the Friday night sorted, the whole of the Saturday, and also the Sunday. But we have also organised a citywide poster campaign, which is all paid for and lined up now. I had a conversation with the University Economics Department and the University Economics Department to try and get some of their students interested. Also spoke to a few other people with some views on the city of Dundee and how it's been struggling for the last period anyway, and maybe since 2008 in particular. So a lot of conversations and a lot of thinking about how we can actually improve the awareness of economics within the city and hopefully making a difference. So it was a brilliant weekend, but certainly my highlight was meeting up with you, Karen. So that's what we were up to last week. Any thoughts on what's been happening today or over the weekend in terms of economics?
Well, yes. So tax avoidance is topical at the moment because the chairman of the Conservative Party, Nadeem Zahawi, he's getting a hard time about the amount of tax that he forgot to pay or didn't notice to pay. And because it's such a huge amount of money, I think no one can relate to it. Or, probably about 99% of the population really can't relate to that kind of oversight.
It's like 3 million, isn't it? It's not I forgot to submit an invoice or something like that. It's clearly he designed a vehicle to avoid that tax. And having read a thread on Twitter just last week, I feel quite confident in saying that, and because he was going through a process of suing everyone who said that. But it looks very, very clearly like a classic case of tax avoidance, creating a vehicle to not pay tax, which was incredible considering he was negotiating all of this while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So it's one of these conversations. If you have them with anyone from any other country, they're saying, "Oh, when did he resign?" Or when was he sacked? That's just there's just that automatic assumption that there'll be some kind of logical end to it. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, it's a noxious business, this tax avoidance, which is so endemic in the UK. And, it deprives people of an income that should occur. If the money is not being spent here, then it's not supporting someone's business. It's not, helping to pay, keeping the deficit down. So that we can justify paying for more public service institutions. And, we, contrary to what the Conservatives are always saying, we do not have a huge public service. It could do with being bigger. And people will notice that during the pandemic, it's the civil service that really matters. When you're in a situation of extremis, that's what really matters, and it needs to be as robust as possible. So yeah, it's just noxious, and people just don't like it, and it's been going on for far too long.
Absolutely. And it is very timely, this episode, because we recorded it just over a week ago, and it really is looking at the impact of avoiding taxes and also a way of trying to get around this idea of having much more control over the global tax structure to ensure, or try as best you can, that tax avoidance and evasion doesn't happen. So this is a 45-minute interview with Alex from the Tax Justice Network. It's fascinating, and I know tax is something that a lot of people might think, oh, this is going to be a bit boring, but actually it goes into so many different areas around the kind of institutional setup, who has control globally, what impact does that decision-making process have on individuals and on companies. So it's really fascinating. I really do hope you enjoy the episode tonight. And just to let you know, we're not coming back on at the end for various practical reasons on my end, but we look forward to seeing you next week. But I will be following the comments, so please do comment and also ask any questions. Kieran, I'll see you, but not in person. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Hi, Alex. Welcome to SCOTONOMICS. Please, could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a tax justice campaigner?
Sure. Look, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's very good to be with you. So I'm an economist, or at least I don't know, I was an economist. And, you know, something over 20 years ago, I was a junior researcher at Oxford University, working on kind of questions of firm size, why firms of different sizes invest in different ways, and the kind of financing that they have. But I began to do more and more work on kind of on the international development side, looking at the reasons why patterns of investment into lower income countries were perhaps different, and then starting to look at the broad range of things around the way that finance flows in and out of different countries. And pretty quickly that takes you to tax and to tax havens and to thinking about the scale of tax abuse in the world, and both by individuals and by companies not paying their taxes. And from there, quite quickly to just how big an impact it would have on countries at all income levels, whether it's Scotland or Malawi, if you like, if most of that tax abuse was stopped, the kind of resources that we'd have to fund public services, to make sure everyone was included, and the ways that we could tackle the kind of inequalities that scar all of our societies. So I've kind of bounced about between research and more advocacy roles with the likes of Christian Aid, the Centre for Global Development, but I've kind of always more or less had some involvement in the wider network of the tax justice network, and so when the opportunity came up in 2015 to come in first as director of research and then chief executive, it kind of felt very much like coming home. And I guess it's the balance between the research and the advocacy that we do that keeps things interesting. And so here I am.
So when you were a researcher and you're going, you're discovering all of this, was there a kind of a slow rage building? You thought, I really have to do something about this. I have knowledge about this now, and I have to be active.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there were kind of different threads coming through. So one thing was John Christensen, my predecessor, came to see my boss at Oxford, and we had this chat about how few people there were working on this, because by that stage we'd with my boss, who's Val P. Fitzgerald, who's a development economist, we'd kind of worked on background papers for the so I should take you back a step. So in 1997, the Blair government comes in. There is a degree of optimism about things. One of the tangible steps that they took was to make the Department for International Development a cabinet level position, and so to give development more prominence. And the DFID, the Department for International Development, ended up writing or holding the pen for the first white paper that government did on globalization and poverty. And so for the first time, because they came to us for the background papers, for the first time the UK government had an express position that tax havens are bad for development and contribute to poverty, which it might seem odd, but they hadn't actually had that before. And so John Christensen came to see us, knowing that we were sort of responsible for getting that into the white paper, and that we'd worked on an Oxfam paper around the same time, which was this first one in 2000 that said tax havens are a big issue for poverty worldwide. And so a very small group of people who'd actually done some work on this. And with John saying, you know, look, there's something moving here, the more that I was doing research in this area, looking at things like the role of tax in Sudan under the Bashir dictatorship and how it was being used to worsen inequality. So thinking about this at the national level as well as the international aspects, the more I came to think, you know, I could write the perfect paper, you know, the answer to everything, sitting in my office in Oxford, and nothing would happen. You know, the world wouldn't change. Nobody would notice. You know, it would be the tree dropping in the forest, and what would be the point?
Yeah.
So when Charles Abugre, who is a Ghanaian economist who was running the policy work at Christian Aid, came to me and said, "Look, you know, we'd like to start the first big campaign on tax, but we need someone who understands the research on this. What do you think about coming sort of into the advocacy space?" I thought, yeah, you know, this is, if I'm meant to do anything, I guess it's this. And that, in a sense, is kind of the beginning of kind of crossing that line out of academia and thinking, yeah, you can contribute in a different way.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I'm really glad that you took that step. So we've got you on today because I noticed that the beginning of November last year in 2022, there's something quite historic happened for international social justice. Can you tell us a bit about the United Nations resolution for an intergovernmental tax framework?
This is something that's been a long time in the making and still has a very long way to go. But yeah, it's a momentous step, what's been achieved. Perhaps as context, you know, I should explain something about the way that the international tax rules are set. I mean, really, for 100 years, you know, it's been the group of, well, what were then imperial powers at the League of Nations that set the basis for the way that we tax multinational companies in particular, but also individuals with assets that they're holding outside of their country of tax residence. So all of the international tax questions really sat with the League of Nations, and particularly for multinational companies, the decisions that they took in the late 20s and early 1930s really set the basis for the rules that we still have today. Now, multinational companies at that stage were really quite simple creatures. You know, they were investors in the metropolis, so in the UK, with one or at most two operations in a colony. And the decision was really about, you know, should the colony get some tax revenue from this, or is it okay if it's all in the metropolis? And so the decisions they took were about just making a bit of a split between that. Nowadays, multinational companies are much more complex, often operate in 100 jurisdictions, and have quite different activities in different places. It isn't just production over here and sales over here, or processing and then sales. Perhaps there's a lot more going on and a lot more opportunities to shift around where the profits are declared and not pay taxes, which is, you know, why we're at this position now. Our estimates are that, you know, there's more than $300 billion of lost revenue from just the biggest multinationals each year around the world, and you know, those numbers pretty quickly turn into significant reductions in things like child mortality if you were to convert it back into the lost public services. But the League of Nations winds up kind of going into the Second World War, and afterwards is replaced by the United Nations. So the obvious thing would be for the United Nations to take on the role of setting tax rules. But the imperial powers recognize that they don't have the same influence at the UN because you have lots of current and then former colonies joining in who have different views on things like tax. So the OECD is kind of repurposed, and having been kind of a European reconstruction body after the Second World War, becomes formally the OECD in 1960 and is quickly given the right to set tax rules as a rich countries club. And it's continued that to this day. In some ways, it's one of the kind of the most obvious structural legacies of empire in terms of where power still sits. And although they've made efforts at different times to kind of include some lower income countries, it's been called out repeatedly by those lower income countries as not giving them an effective voice, not giving them a full vote, or indeed any vote at all. So the pressure has built over the last, particularly the last 20 years, and then really in the last 3 years, to say we need to move tax into the OECD, out of the OECD and into the UN. We know that lower income countries lose a bigger share of their tax revenues every year to tax abuse. So these countries which already have a lower rate of tax to GDP lose a bigger share because of these abuses that the OECD fails to check. And we know that these same countries don't get a voice at the OECD. So it doesn't mean that if we move to the UN, everything gets fixed, but there is a chance, there is a possibility that a more effective voice could allow a reduction in these glaring inequalities in the distribution of taxing rights between countries.
It's really noticeable with the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, that you don't see on their member countries any African countries at all. And interestingly, they have on their website a motto which says, "Together we create better policies for better lives." But, together is obviously an exclusive club. And it's very obvious when you look at the member states which countries are not included in that club. So yeah, it really is. When I heard about this, I really realised that this is really momentous. It's not just momentous for the former colonies. I think it'll be momentous for places like Scotland, for England, for Ireland, for everywhere. Really, I think it will bring equality eventually, a much more equality. Do you think it will?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Sometimes people think that we're attacking the OECD, and therefore what we want would be bad for OECD member countries, and actually that's really not the case. So we need to ask who benefits from the status quo, and at one level, yeah, it's a set of countries, and it's mainly European and North American countries who are the founding members, and then, as you say, there are some members from particularly Latin America and a couple from East Asia. So it's expanded a bit, but only a bit. Most countries of the world and most people in the world live in countries that are not members, and that includes, yes, the entirety of Africa, for example. But also every country below upper middle income is outside. The other issue is how the OECD operates. Right? The OECD, the UN was established specifically to carry out negotiations between countries with very different interests, very different income levels, different regions, and to do it with a degree of transparency and accountability. So when the UN debates tax, when they debated this resolution, for example, we could effectively be in the room, it's on telly, to know which countries were taking what positions. When the OECD debates tax, there is literally no transparency at all. And there are very well-established mechanisms for the business lobby to be involved directly in those decisions, but not for civil society. So it's not just that there's a group of countries that have more power than others. The dynamic within those countries is that the elites from multinational companies and their advisors at the big four accounting firms, the major law firms, and perhaps wealthy individuals are very strongly involved in that process. The rest of us, including, in a sense, people who might think that their governments are in favour of more progressive taxation, can't see what's being said, including by our own governments. Now, what's the effect of that? Well, it's much easier, even for a government that's kind of committed, let's say, it's much easier for them to be talked out of doing anything difficult or progressive by a lobby group that's fully involved, knowing that the public won't see what they do anyway. And therefore, there's no accountability for individual governments and no power for individual citizens to hold anyone to account for what's happening. The UN isn't perfect, Lord, it's not perfect, but it offers a lot of ways in, a lot of opportunities for accountability. And so the fact that what we've got in this resolution is the beginning of intergovernmental discussions about the possibility. That's all. It's not more than that at this stage, but about the possibility of creating a genuinely inclusive and transparent global framework on tax cooperation. And
now, to say, I listened to the podcast about it, it was quite clear that a lot of these countries weren't very gracious in losing to this resolution. And could you give us a couple of examples of ungraciousness on the part of some of these countries? Which ones do you think were particularly embarrassing?
Well, look, what always happens when these issues are raised at the UN is you get it before it gets off the ground, when it's still a draft. Say the G77 group of lower income countries will have brought something forward. Now, the G77 is 134 countries. It is the majority of the population of the world. And if they want to, they've got the numbers to push anything through. But they know that if they do that, with the opposition of all of the rich countries, as it were, that it will just get blocked in a different way. So every few years, they bring forward a motion that would move things down this road, and then the EU blocks it. The United States block it. And depending on where it gets to, a set of other countries, Japan and Korea, the core OECD members block it. What happened this time is, there was kind of negotiations. It was more seriously done, partly because we had this a ministerial declaration from the African finance ministers in May last year, which called for negotiations to begin. So there was a very strong starting point, and the G77, led by Nigeria, who did a fantastic job, really held the line, kept dealing with the different obstacles raised by, particularly as it goes, we understand, by Liechtenstein, by Germany for the EU bloc, by the United States. The Nigerian delegation kept just dealing with them, saying, yes, okay, we can change this, but we're not losing the key thing. Till eventually it came to a vote. And normally, again, the G77 won't push it to a vote because they don't want a kind of a divisive split. But this time they did, and every single country accepted and joined the consensus. So there was unanimous support to move ahead with this. But as you say, what then happened was this kind of unbelievably ungracious set of comments afterwards. So countries can make their positions, can state their positions after the votes happened. And what you had was, the EU, the US, Japan, Korea. I mean, South Korea was kind of extraordinarily bitter, complained that they hadn't known that this was coming, even though it had been being negotiated for 3 months at that stage and has been tabled again and again over the last few years. They hadn't known it was coming. There wasn't time to think about it. They hadn't been able to prepare their position, and reiterating this point that pretty much all of the OECD countries made, that this risks duplicating the OECD process. Now, of course, it's only a duplication if you think that the OECD process is working and you have power within it. Now, most OECD countries even recognize that the OECD process at the minute just isn't working, but effectively they were saying we'd rather have something that doesn't work in which we have disproportionate power than something that could work but where we might have slightly less power. And that's a pretty sad position. But again, at least at the UN, we get that on the public record. Those discussions at the OECD simply never make it into the public domain. So already, in a sense, we're seeing the dynamic shifting.
Alex, could you outline what the problem is at the moment? So we're talking about tax avoidance. Is this a huge issue? And what happens when individuals and corporations don't pay tax? What impact does it have?
So yeah, there's two core issues in international tax abuse, if you like. So on the one hand, it's the loss of revenues. Now, we estimate in the State of Tax Justice reports that we publish annually with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and Public Services International, one of the global union federations, that at the moment, the losses worldwide due to multinationals tax abuse and tax abuse by individuals hiding their assets and income streams offshore is getting towards $500 billion each year. And the biggest losses are in OECD countries like the UK, but as a share of current tax revenues, the biggest losses are in lower income countries. And if you take it as something like a share of public health spending, that's a much more dramatic position. It might be 5% of public health spending on average across OECD countries, but it's about 50% in lower income, particularly in low income countries. So it's dramatic losses in terms of what governments can do to include and protect their citizens. And if you think in the context of the pandemic, those losses really have quite directly led to losses of life. So one aspect is there. That $500 billion at a financial level, if you think that those are the revenue losses, but the amount of money that's going across borders every year undeclared or illicitly is another order of magnitude bigger, or it's certainly into the several trillions. That makes it a material, in accounting terms, it's a material materially significant problem in terms of the global economy. There's a bit of the global economy, more than 5% of the, whatever it is, $80 trillion or so world GDP, that is lost to us, that we can't see. And so even if we didn't care about any of this, we just cared about sort of knowing more or less that we could get our arms around the actual global economy as it exists, this is a significant problem. But the second piece is what it means for us within individual countries, because these aren't just neutral, in a sense, random losses. They are losses that have a very particular impact on distribution and on political possibility. What we're talking about are the biggest bits of our direct tax system. So taxes on incomes, profits, and capital gains, and wealth, if we have wealth taxes, being stymied by these processes. Now, that does a number of things. So the most immediate effect is it makes the tax system that we have much less progressive than it is on paper. We are unable to make the progressive bits of tax work at the top end, whether that's in the UK or in Malawi or any other country. It's the same issue. Because that's true, we're also then unable to change the tax system on paper to make it more progressive in the way that citizens pretty much everywhere want to, because we know that if we make it more progressive on paper at the top end, we're likely to see more cheating at the top end. And until we can stop the cheating, it may not be worth changing things on paper. Now, there is a lot that we can do about that. So in the UK, the numbers vary, but something between 11 and 18 pounds of revenue is raised for every £1 that we might put into employing people at the tax authority. So every time that this government cuts the tax authority, all the cuts that have happened since the financial crisis in the UK have done much more damage than any possible saving. And all of that damage, more or less, is coming from foregone tax revenues at the top end, because that's where all the abuse is. All the data we have shows that it's the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01% who are disproportionately responsible for the greatest share of the tax losses. So what does that do to us politically? Forget the money we're losing. It leaves us in a position where all of us, countries all around the world, are much less able to deliver on any kind of promise to reduce the sort of overlapping inequalities that we face, including by gender and race and so on, not just vertical income inequalities. So we end up in societies that are much more unequal than they should be, where many more people see their human rights denied because of the failure of the state to be able to tax effectively or progressively. That's tax injustice, if you like, in action. And that's why Tax Justice Network exists and why this fight matters.
Yeah, it was reported on Wednesday that HMRC have failed to collect 42 billion last year.
I mean, that number is, based on HMRC's own estimates of the tax gap, which have been, criticised by all and sundry for the best part of a decade now. They are basically marking their own homework. So that number excludes a whole set of very important issues, including most multinational tax abuse. So, on the one hand, I'm pleased that, in the UK, you can see headlines about that and it's putting some pressure. But I also want to say that number's not the real number. That's much smaller than, in fact, what the scale of the problem is.
And that's a big number, Alex. I mean, that is more or less the budget for the Scottish Government per year.
And look, the Scottish case is a particularly frustrating one. I'm speaking in a personal capacity, but I happen to be a commissioner for the Scottish Government's Poverty and Inequality Commission. And, our mandate as a commission, we're a statutory commission set up by the Scottish Government to hold the government itself to account for its legislated commitments to sharply reduce child poverty and broader commitments to reduce inequalities. Now, we've just set up a tax working group for the first time, and shortly we'll be putting out a call for evidence for submissions, because it's so clear that the Scottish Government's hands are really kind of tied behind its back. It's doing everything it can, or not quite everything, and we have some recommendations for additional things it could do, but it's done a great deal, including by pushing up top rate income taxes, which is an important move. Within the constraints it has under the devolved settlement, it's doing a great deal to try to protect Scottish society from the damage that's being caused by the decisions taken in Westminster. But until the Scottish Government has a longer term agenda about taxation, it will always be kind of putting sticking plasters. Now, part of that is about changing the devolution settlement, and it might be an argument for full independence. What it definitely is an argument to use the powers that they've currently got as fully as they can. And there's a whole set of things that you can do there, one of which, circling back, would be for the Scottish Government to offer to the government in Westminster to put additional resources into enforcement. Right? Because you have these higher income tax rates in Scotland, there is a higher risk than in the rest of the UK of people either moving their income into other bits of the UK or finding other ways to cheat. Now, Scotland actually, from the evidence we have, seems to have higher tax compliance, higher tax morale in some of the ways that we're able to measure that, because I think there's a stronger sense that two things normally drive tax morale. One is your belief that other people are paying their taxes, and the second one is your belief that the government is using the money well, it's redistributing, and that seems to be stronger in Scotland than the rest of the UK. So maybe we don't need to worry too much, but knowing what tax abuse at the top end looks like, I think there's a very good chance that Scotland is suffering disproportionate losses from that type of abuse. And if the Westminster government won't put the resources into enforcement, the Scottish Government could actually offer to do it. And if we're getting the kind of multipliers we're seeing, 11 times or 18 times the return, then the Scottish share of that, even if it wasn't particularly targeted at Scotland, the Scottish share of the returns on that would be much more than it would cost the Scottish Government. Now, it would be a pretty damning condemnation of the Westminster government if, under your devolution settlement, you had this Scottish government coming back to you saying, you are so bad at this that we're actually going to subsidise you to stop being quite as bad.
But that would be difficult, wouldn't it?
It would. I mean, politically, it's kind of hard to see, but at the very least, it would. I think the offer on the table from the Scottish government would potentially force Westminster to say, look, this is quite embarrassing.
Are you saying that we know that the Westminster government have decimated HMRC? We know that HMRC are very good value for money, as you say. For every pound that they cost, they're bringing in £18. That's a well-known statistic. Are you suggesting that we increase Revenue Scotland, the staffing at Revenue Scotland, and essentially become gatekeepers for the whole of the UK within Scotland, and that we perhaps then wouldn't have money to pay our nurses and our teachers?
So this is, for the Scottish Government, it would be a difficult thing to sort of take themselves through. You'd want to be absolutely certain about the evidence at each level. But there's another complication that Revenue Scotland doesn't have, in most cases, the right to carry out the enforcement work. So what it would be, the parallel that I've drawn in kind of proposing this is something that the Department for International Development did about 20 years ago now. So they went to the City of London police and said, look, we know, and the evidence is very clear, that there's a huge amount of stolen assets from lower income countries that either come through or indeed stop in London. And you don't care about that because you don't care about that, but we want you to care about that. So what we're going to do is use aid money to pay for City of London police to work on anti-corruption and to recover stolen assets. And the return on that, it's a very small investment. It's in the, I think, kind of £5-10 million initially, and then sustained over a few years. The return on that was dramatic, because they identified such a large volume of stolen assets and were able to work in recovery processes which they couldn't otherwise have done. If you think of that as the parallel, what you'd be saying here is that the Scottish Government could offer to fund not Revenue Scotland but HMRC enforcement. Now, ideally, it would be targeted specifically at corporate profit shifting and top incomes within Scotland. But it might be that you effectively subsidise it across the UK, knowing that the return for Scotland is still going to be significantly more than the cost. But it's, as you say, when you're saying we could use that money instead to pay nurses in Scotland, you'd have to be really sure about the return for the Scottish Government to say, yeah, this is an investment that we should make. And ideally, the Westminster Government would say, look, this is an investment that we should make. And the fact that we're not doing this is, as with the Republicans in the United States, the defunding of the tax authority is a very deliberate decision to have higher inequality, to allow greater tax abuse that allows the elites to be undertaxed compared to the rest of us. And it's that really that we should be calling out, and the Scottish Government should be calling out. But how you get there is I think the question.
We're speaking about Scotland as a user of a currency and the United Kingdom as the issuer of a currency. And tax plays a very different role for an user and for an issuer. So Scotland, when it has taxes, spends the taxes. It's the United Kingdom as the issuer of the currency doesn't fund public services with taxes. So there's a difference between how Scotland and the importance of tax in Scotland compared to the United Kingdom.
The most important thing that tax does isn't actually to do with money. We talk about the 4 R's of tax: revenue and redistribution, the two it's easier to think of. Repricing, which is the extent to which the tax system allows you to change the price of public goods and bads, whether that's tobacco consumption that has big public social costs, or something like carbon emissions. And if we don't have effective tax systems, our chances of preventing the world burning are significantly reduced. But the 4th R is probably the most important and the one we overlook most often, and it's representation. It turns out, the old American war cry for independence: no taxation without representation. The US as a colony didn't want to be paying taxes to Westminster without having political representation in Westminster, or that was one of the arguments being made. But the evidence suggests it's actually the other way around. Without taxation, there's no effective representation. there are very few things, if you kind of look at all the evidence, there are very few things, possibly only one, that's actually consistently associated with improvements in the quality of government. So reductions in corruption and improvements in the extent to which governments are inclusive and respond to the breadth of their populations. And that thing is tax. In particular, it's the share of tax in government spending. So when you have governments that are highly reliant on natural resource income, for example, or foreign aid, over time, they're likely to become worse governments. The administration overall becomes worse. You get greater problems of corruption. It's because, in a sense, nobody likes paying tax, except me. That, you know, we hold governments to account. When they take tax off us, we're annoyed, you know, and we say, you know, what are you doing with my money? And it's not really my money, but anyway, so this role of tax turns out to be kind of the big deal. If we're thinking about effective states over time that can meet our human rights, then it's tax that matters. If you look at something like health, where we have some quite good evidence, what you see is if you increase the share of tax in government spending, but you hold government spending constant, then more of that spending goes on public health. Right? So without changing the total budget, just having a greater reliance on tax, you end up with more spending on health. Now, why would that be? Answer, because you're more responsive to people and people want better healthcare.
But it's not a reliance on tax. This is what I really want to get to. The government doesn't spend taxes. We don't tax people and then spend the money, because I think this is a crucial point for me, Alex. And I think that we over-egg this importance of tax to fund things, and then we don't cover these other really important issues that you've covered, like the representation and the redistribution. And that's why I started that. In Scotland, we need tax to pay for things, but the United Kingdom doesn't use taxes to pay for spending. And I just kind of, you know, because I think that's a really important point, and to separate the difference between the Scottish government and its spending and the UK government and its spending.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you could say is, you know, the Scottish government has a much harder budget constraint than the UK government does, because it doesn't have the power to create debt in the same way. So, yeah,
it creates its own currency. So,
well, which is a form, or, you know, it's sort of equivalent to creating debt if you're not backing it with hard assets. So you have a flexibility which, without its own currency, the Scottish government doesn't currently have. I would say, you know, this
it's a liability for the bank, but it's not a debt.
Well, I think that's kind of language rather than.
It doesn't have to be. Have to pay back. So
the kind of the role of tax, when you think that through, you know, there is an extreme position that says because governments can create their own money, or some governments, they never need to pay for anything. And that's kind of unhelpful, I think, you know, when you take it to that extreme. You know, it is important that we have a broad understanding of the role of money and the way that it works and how governments are able to pay for things without raising tax revenue first. And in fact, it's kind of always the other way around. You pay for stuff and then you raise taxes to contribute to the costs of having, you know, whether we like it or not. We've just had in the UK a very good example of some of the limits on what you can do. You know, and while the Truss Kwarteng experiment is sort of the opposite, I imagine, of how any of us would have chosen to spend a large amount of money, it shows that you know, because of the system that we're in, however much we might want to change that, governments are quite heavily constrained at some point by the reactions of markets, that they can make things much worse by not acting as if those constraints existed. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, that we shouldn't think through all the arguments of MMT and so on, and think in a kind of very clear-eyed way about the freedoms that do exist when you are responsible for your own currency. But it does mean we should also, you know, steer clear of the kind of an extreme position that says none of that matters and we can do what we want.
So if we're looking about a more kind of consistent and meaningful global tax system, What would that look like, Alex? What do we hope that all this work that's been moved from the OECD to the United Nations will actually lead to? And then my follow-on question from that is, what impact will that have on a new state like Scotland that might have been thinking, hey, we can really reduce corporation tax like Ireland has and like the Netherlands has to give us a little bit of a boost as an independent nation?
Breaking them down, I'm being distracted by the second one because it's provocative. But starting with the first one, look, I talked about how the League of Nations kind of set the basis for corporate tax rules in the 1920s and 30s, and that's the basis that the OECD is still defending today. What that really is the arm's length principle. And this is the idea that if you have two subsidiaries within the same multinational group, as long as the price that they declare for the transactions that happen between them are arm's length prices, the same prices that you'd see in the open market between two unrelated entities, then basically where the profit ends up will be where it should end up, and it can be taxed there, and we're all good. And so you need to create within a multinational, and there's this enormous infrastructure, and all the big accounting firms and law firms kind of spend or are paid a great deal of money to work on this, what are called transfer prices for those transactions that happen inside a multinational. Now, of course, that opens up this enormous opportunity to manipulate those prices in order to get the profit where you want it, i.e. into the subsidiary where the effective tax rate is 0, which it is relatively easy to engineer in somewhere like Ireland or the Netherlands, as you mentioned. The alternative, which the League of Nations considered and ultimately chose against, is unitary taxation. And this is the idea that you tax multinationals at the level where the unit where they maximize their profits. Multinationals don't maximize their profits in a given subsidiary. Amazon doesn't care what Amazon UK, or indeed any of the different Amazon UK subsidiaries, it doesn't care what their profit is on paper. It cares about the profit that Amazon makes globally. So you say, okay, that's what's being maximized. That's the thing that we need to tax. How do we do that, given that we have different countries involved? Well, we say, where is the activity that gives rise to this tax? So if, let's say, 10% of Amazon's workforce and 10% of Amazon's sales take place in the UK, then 10% of that global profit should be apportioned to the UK, and then the UK applies its tax rate. And what that means is that you cut through all of the paraphernalia and the billions upon billions of pounds and dollars that are spent on transfer pricing manipulation every year, and you just have these numbers. And we've got those numbers. They're not within multinationals. You need those numbers. It's not difficult. And we now have country by country reporting proposal that the Tax Justice Network kind of pushed from its origins in 2003. That data basically exists, needs to be improved, but it's there. So we can do it. And that's, I think, the big win if we begin negotiations in a UN setting where most countries face significant losses because transfer pricing and the arm's length principle are just unfit for purpose. That's where we're going to end up with unitary taxation. So what does that mean for Scotland? If you had an independent Scotland, or let's say a smaller, higher income country, then instead of there being this opportunity that still exists for a country like Ireland to say, we're going to screw our neighbours in order to bring in more revenue here, or in fact, we won't necessarily bring in that much more revenue, but we want to get companies to come here to give us real activity in exchange for being able to abuse taxes elsewhere. You pretty much close that door because you're only going to get a tax base that's built on the real activity taking place in your country. Now, if you were to flick a switch and do this tomorrow, Scotland's share of corporate tax revenue would be significantly higher than it is now because the UK as a whole is so bad at defending its own corporate tax base. And as I say, that's partly a policy choice to make the UK more attractive, not in the kind of the extremity with which Ireland or the Netherlands have done it, but still to make the UK more attractive for profit shifting from elsewhere. But Scotland has, in an independent Scotland, you'd have the levers to choose how to act. Trying to get in now in the race to the bottom would be a disaster. Even if the rules stayed as they are, you'd never be able to compete with the well-established players, and you'd simply be giving away revenue in a kind of desperate attempt to try it. But a switch to unitary taxation would be very empowering for all sorts of countries, including in independent Scotland, because you could say companies are going to come here and invest for real reasons. They're going to come here because we have a highly skilled workforce, because we have good infrastructure, because we have a rule of law that's sound and well respected. We have good administration. We have ports and access. If we're able to join the European Union, we have a doorway into the biggest economic zone in the world. So all of that is a kind of hugely attractive if you have a tax system that doesn't incentivize tax abuse the way that we do at the moment. So it would be a big win, I think, for an independent Scotland if we could get that UN process over the line.
I think it's going to be a really positive thing worldwide.
Alex, thanks very much for your time. We've covered so much in that period.
No, thanks a lot. Look, really interesting. I hope it's been useful.
Very useful. Thank you.